strange little Dharma teachings that come through the very fact of Zoom. Like one of my favorites is turn off self-view, I think. Sort of sums up our entire practice. So, it's lovely to see you all. And to see you at a time like the one we're in, which is such a deeply vertiginous moment in so many ways. Deeply uncertain times. There's that old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Well, maybe there's actually something valuable in this very uncertainty. Perhaps there's even a value in the curse called interesting times. But even in so-called uninteresting times, our lives are pure uncertainty. That is where we have to find the heart of our rest, at the undivided heart of this uncertainty. That there is an undivided heart at the very middle of what is happening. You could almost say that our job, our inspiring task as people of the way is to actually accept uncertainty as useful, to find the use and the art and the discipline of uncertainty. So let's call this talk The Uses of Uncertainty in the kind of time we're in, which is so vertiginous in the sense that it suddenly feels as though there's very little we can rely on. The established sort of chocks of the reality we've come to trust are being removed or weakened at the moment. There's the entire geophysical moment with no clear horizon. I'm speaking, of course, about climate change, collapse, transformation, which at the moment does not yet seem to be transforming us enough. The heat is on us as human beings, but the natural response is strangely, weirdly missing. And there's also this great geopolitical moment we're in. A very strange moment with a lot of tearing and extreme cruelty in it, with a sense of anyone even reaching for clear judgment not happening, not truly happening. Clear judgment is so easily tricked, it seems, or unseated. Instead of politicians or leaders, we have apparent con men, strong men, grifters. Of course, I'm speaking here about the strangeness of this moment with the US election hanging over a certain kind of void, and the gleeful cruelty and the mocking indifference that seems to go with this moment of astonishing uncertainty. So it's an astonishing moment. So can we actually say we are exactly what is needed? We have exactly what is needed to meet this moment. Jojo gives a very interesting image of this moment, this kind of moment. A monk asked him, among the 10,000 things, what is the most solid? Jojo said, when we curse at each other, that we can go on flapping our lips. When we spit at each other, that we can have our saliva flow out. Well, the fact that we can go on flapping our lips when we curse at each other and that when we spit at each other, saliva flows out, that's easy to confirm. We can see it around us. We can notice it, perhaps even in ourselves. And there's another sense here in which we truly can rely on the fact that we can flap our lips, we can have saliva flow out, we can stand up, we can walk, we can breathe, we can grow tired, we can lie down. These are, in a sense, the ongoing treasures of our ability to be, that we are here, and that we are, as someone else once said, wonderfully using our deepest unborn self-nature, just in being here and complete, whether we yet have woken to that fact or not. Nevertheless, complete. So there is that. But there's also the sense of the confronting nature of abusive talk, of violent speech, of strange denials of reality. This is very confronting. So we need to look at what happens when we are confronted. One of the things that is immediately obvious is that the self grows hard. We discover a hard self when confrontation is strong, is in our face. It's not too hard to flap your lips and have all sorts of opinions about what is happening right now. It's not too hard to feel astonishment, if not very active dislike, of the apparent indifference or abusive response to what is so obviously real, for example, about global warming. So what happens when we're confronted and this hard self becomes apparent? When we have all sorts of convictions immediately, that's the hardening of the self. Convictions arrive about, well, what are they when we really look? These rapidly arriving convictions. What are they when we look? How solid are they? How second-hand are they? Remember the offer of Lin Ji when he said, whatever confronts you, don't believe it. Don't believe it. This is not to say, he's by no means saying, turn your back on it, refuse to acknowledge its reality. No. He's saying, what is its reality, this confronting moment? Don't believe its solidity. Make that the first move. Because at the very deepest level, is there anything sufficiently outside your very self, other enough to actually be in a position to confront you, to be confronting you, someone called you, something discrete and separate called you? Can we really find a way to carve ourselves out of the whole when we really look? Is it even remotely possible? The sense of fear that a confronting moment immediately arouses, with full-on cortisol arousal as well. It immediately says, yes, there's plenty to believe is wrong with this moment, must be fixed, must be amended. And there's a lot of very self-protective hatred that can rise up with that moment of feeling confronted by what seems to be happening. So what can we do with this? Whatever confronts you, don't believe it. I think Lin Ji is pointing to the deep healing art of uncertainty, of suspending what we think we know. Suspending it enough to actually be in a position to discover what is happening. To do this in the name, this suspending of our immediate belief. Suspend that belief to discover, in the name of non-harming, or in the name of love, or in the name of wisdom, of growing clear. It begins here in suspending our knowing. So I think Jiao is pointing to the fact that the most solid thing on earth, strangely enough, even though it has no discoverable substance, but the most apparently solid thing on earth is this sense of self. It is the views that we hold. It is the opinions that, in fact, as Pema Chodron said, she said, Nirvana is just what is happening, minus our opinions about it. So how is it that opinions and views can transform something that we might call a habitable good? How do we manage to transform it with these views? When we look at this sense of self, we find memories as well. There's a lot of memories involved in the formation of these views and beliefs. But the memories, when we really examine memories, they're remarkably close to dream. We dream our memories. They change shape behind us. And underlying the sense of being confronted is usually hatreds and fears, often the fear of rejection. We're more warm, mammalian, bonding beings. Rejection is a terrible fear, a terrible threat. I think a lot of this is in play in this sense of such a wildly confronting moment as the one we're in. Confronting as in everybody, confronting everybody else. So beyond these things, our views, our opinions, our memories, trustworthy or not as they may be, beyond these things, what can we really find of the self? And what's it like when we drop the view? In his book, Bring Me the Rhinoceros, John Tarrant relates the moment when he had flown back to Tasmania to be with his once again dying mother. She had a few goes at it, and on this occasion, it looked pretty serious. And he was in the room, the hospital room, with his mother in bed, the hospital bed, his father trying to urge her to eat. And she was irately batting his hand away and saying, "You're always trying to make me do things. Leave me alone, I don't want to eat." And he's saying, "But you must, dear, you must, my dear, because, you must have something to eat." And nurses coming and going, and a sense of anxiety in the room, and the room seemed very small and shrunken in around this kind of drama going on. And then John speaks about deciding, almost as an experiment, drop the view, drop all view of what's happening here. And he speaks about discovering that without the view, you could only hear an old, worn, but loving pattern going on between everybody. And a lot of caring of the nurses coming and going. And a lot of love even in the tension and fear of this person we love, even though she's very difficult, is now leaving us. All of that dropped away. And he said, you couldn't really see very much going on beyond love. There was love. Without the view, there is a remarkable openness of possibility and of being. And surely if we're going to have a response that can be of true help, it's only going to arrive in that openness. Its wisdom, its intelligence, its creative spark can only be found in that openness. The Tao Te Ching says the softest thing on earth overtakes the hardest thing on earth, the most solid thing on earth. So that leaves a remarkably beautiful life koan. What is the softest thing at a given moment? You know, perhaps you could say the Buddha makes it very clear in the Dhammapada, where he says hatred does not cease by hatred at any time. Hatred ceases by love. This is an unalterable law. So is the softest thing this openness, this not knowing, is it love? Is it other than love? Is it the expression or rather even the action and discipline of love? Of openness, of love, of openness, of love. Most of you will know the story of Hakuin when he was confronted with a newborn baby. He was living as a monk, an alms-gathering monk, outside a little fishing village in a hut, a modest hut. And the villagers were very happy to have him there looking after him in their way, while they felt as though he looked after them in his way with the sincerity of his practice. And then there was that loud knocking on the door and the angry woman standing there with a newborn baby and her daughter standing beside her looking away. And she thrust the baby at Hakuin and said, "You thieving phony of a monk. Here, you take," she's told us everything, "here, you take the baby." And remember, he says, is it so? And he takes the baby. It's definitely not a baby he has helped bring into the world, but at such a moment, is there some aspect in which this is his baby to take care of? Yes, obviously. But deeper than that is the sense of, is it so, rather than it is one way or the other. It is wrong. It is right. It so makes vast room to actually catch sight of what is happening, what needs to be done, what can be done. And even more than that, a deep, open question, is this his baby, in one sense? So all of that there is in that breath, is it so? And accepting this very difficult offer of the moment. And then, of course, it's not, I don't know how long it is, it's not reported how many weeks or months go by, but at a certain point, a little further in time, the loud knocking at the door again, and she is back. And she's angry all over again, preemptive anger to cover up her fear and her shame. And she says, "She told us everything. It was the boy in the fish market. Give us back the baby." And Hakuin, holding this newborn baby to his chest against his own heart, holds the baby forth and says, is it so? So once again, this sense of offering the softest thing on earth, both times. So what is it? What's inside this softest thing on earth that seems to be so able to find the way past harming? Could even call it more subtle than non-harming. It does not move in the direction of harming. There's not knowing. It doesn't know better or worse. It does not know right or wrong in the moment of being confronted. The rather cool sounding word equanimity, often associated with blowing out or cooling the passions. Equanimity is one name for this. It's equanimity from a Zen point of view is that step back from knowing. That is the very foundation of loving kindness, of compassion, of taking joy in the joy of others. Equanimity is the fourth of those so-called noble abodes of mind, or there's other ways of naming them, but you could call them expressions of mind, the mind and heart awake. And equanimity is the foundation of them, the foundation discipline, the foundation art form, the foundation utility, you could almost say, of the fact that all things change, all beings will also suffer. It is the way to and right through the very middle of what is happening. James Baldwin, who is coming back to recognition again in this time of Black Lives Matter, and wonderfully so, because he was one of the luminous minds of the 20th century, from my point of view, my estimation. James Baldwin called equanimity the charge. He actually used the words the charge, implying that it is laid on us. Equanimity is the charge laid on us by the truly unfathomable hatred of racism, compound hatreds, compound fears and hatreds, which at times is one of the most murderous forms of that otherness takes in the minds of human beings. And to call it the charge of equanimity is I think, a very beautiful move, because it implies that it's actually incumbent on us to practice opening to the charge and the energy and the creative power of equanimity. When we're feeling confronted, the self hardens dramatically. When we offer some form of "you are welcome here," and the "I don't know" that is within that, when we offer that intimate you that comes with not knowing, not naming, not blaming, naming, shaming, and hardening a sense of the other, but just you are welcome here. There's no subject-object relationship there. There is something more like a communion of subjects. There's a weekly protest that we've been having here doggedly for going on 3 years every week outside the local member's office. Protest, which is simply called Stop the Shame, and it is the shame of our treatment of refugees. It's taken different forms at different times, but always it does involve people passing by and often shouting, confronting abuse at the idea that there should be some shame worth even addressing. And there's one particular man who often would come past, he had some business reason to come past right at that time, between 10 and 12 on Friday mornings. And he would often shout all sorts of angry things. But one time when I was there, he came past, got ready to shout, and I went up to him and engaged him in conversation. And it was very interesting. There's a sense in which even the slogan, "Stop the Shame," is a confronting one. Then I'm not sure that it's beautifully judged anymore. Because if you are apparently shaming people, they are already massively defended against being shamed. And I could sense that in this man. And so after I asked him, why are you seem very upset. What's in this? And quite quickly, I could get to the point of saying, it's scary, isn't it? And that "it's scary, isn't it?" was acknowledging that what the hell does anybody do with the realization that there's 90 million refugees in the world with nowhere to go, and a certain degree of precariousness in all our lives, and a sense perhaps in this man of particular precarity at that moment? He was often saying things like, why don't you care about what's going on here before you care about them? We don't want them here. But after I just reached out and touched his arm and said, it is scary, isn't it? And went into how I feel about it as scary. But he opened up and he was really interested to talk. He was so interested, he went off on his business errand, but turned around on his heel and came back to say some more. I'm not saying necessarily that he was converted to any fresh view. But what did happen is I could see something like the power of that simple move of acknowledging that we share a precarious existence. And it all seemed to open there. That seemed to be the beginning of the softest thing that could overtake the hardest thing on earth. So there is a power in opening within what is, even in when it's approaching or confronting us in devastating form. There's no choice but to open within what is, because it is what is. To attempt to turn away from it is to turn away from our own life, to abandon our own life. So the very art of creative uncertainty seems to lie right at the heart of our Zen or Chan way. And it has done from very earliest times. I'm talking now of 8th century Tang Dynasty China, which is when the kind of, you could almost call it the discipline or the art form of turning things around, turning duality upside down, dropping the subject-object relationship that the very idea of the self hardens around and hardens everything around it, of walking all the way through that as if it were an open gate, which indeed it is. That, or this whole discipline of our way that we call koan mind, for example, it really opened in the most difficult times on earth at that time. You probably know a bit about this, but Tang Dynasty China, it was a time of great cultural strength, but it was a time not unlike the one we're in, where the dominant power on the earth, called China the earth at that time, from a Chinese point of view, it was the whole world. It was growing precarious itself. It was overextended. And it was starting to be, well, the strains of empire were beginning to show, as indeed they are in our world, dominated as it is by the US. So what was happening there was that at the borders there were incursions, and the borders were very, very, very long. And so it was very hard to maintain border control. And so what the Tang emperors at the time started doing was employing mercenary armies raised in those borderlands, in fact. And this was very costly, and it was the ordinary, hard-working, precarious people who had to bear the cost in heavy taxation. So things were getting tricky. And then round about mid-century, 8th century, mid-century, this whole precarious arrangement crumbled when one of the foreign armies simply refused to leave, when their use was determined to be over. And they set up a stronghold right in the capital, Chang'an, known as the An Lushan Rebellion, and many of you will know It ushered in a whole decade of civil war, and following right through that time, a huge collapse of population. It's up to 2/3 of people died. 2 out of 3 people in several large cities died. And China went from being one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen to an utterly devastated, ransacked, hopeless place. The poet, the shining poet of that time, Du Fu, he was trapped in Chang'an during this rebellion, and he wrote this tiny poem that sums up many things. It says, "The nation is destroyed. Mountains and rivers remain." Interesting that Hobart Zen calls itself Mountains and Rivers Zen. And mountains and rivers is, of course, a kind of earthy, concrete Chinese way, particularly Chinese way of saying the fundamental fact of the earth, the wonderful, wondrous, productive, generous fact of the earth. Mountains and rivers remain. The fundamental nature of reality remains, never stops flowing, in fact. At a very ordinary level, although there's nothing ordinary about it, mountains and rivers do confirm with great ease, if we're open and with a listening heart. They are saying, you are welcome here, just as you are. There's no opinion in mountains and rivers about this one we call me. It's blameless as mountains and rivers are blameless. Just as you are, when you can welcome, then there's nothing but welcome here, nothing but welcome coming back to you. Especially when the mind is still enough to rest in I don't know, the place where we truly can rest with some ease. And that's equanimity. That's not clinging to better or worse. Bruce Moody, the American poet, there's just a tiny bit of one of his poems about rain. Rain baffles down. Its oratorio complains of nothing, fears nothing, and nothing can resist. So the old Zen masters of that time, particularly Matsu and Shitao, right at the very time of the Anlushan rebellion and its horrific aftermath of death and destruction and despair, they showed that the way to come to terms with the pain and anguish and distress of life is not by turning away, but by facing into it more deeply. Facing into it because it is life, more deeply. And at the heart of this is relying on what is happening. Not just knowing what is happening, but resting in, relying upon what is happening. It is, of course, the very medium of our ability to know anything at all, to respond accurately at all, relying on what is happening. That's like placing trust in the very fact of being at a very deep level. Isn't that what we practice on our cushions? Placing our trust in every breath, placing our trust in the weight of our bodies on the cushion and the warmth of the body and even the aches and pains of the body. To place our trust in that very fact of being here, in this breath, So being with what is, steady and awake, alert and undazzled. And in that very fact, relinquishing, actually responding by relinquishing the self and offering this open hand of not knowing, Is that not what love does? And if you take time to look closely at Torre Zenji's Bodhisattva's vow, you'll see that being explored. The way that relinquishing the self with an open response to abuse of some kind, relinquishing the self in the face of that, opens what he calls a pure faith, a very strong reliance or trust in what is happening. There being nothing else but what is happening. Where else would you place your trust, your reliance? And it is this sense of opening, depends upon what is happening. And what is happening is always mixed. What we call good. And I'm thinking now of Yun Men's every day is a good day. This is a deep acknowledgement of a mixed world, a thing of wonder, this mixed world. Julian of Norwich, or Juliane of Norwich, wonderful woman, mystic of her dates are 1342 to 1429 or thereabouts. And if you look at those dates, you'll discover she lived her entire life during the worst pandemic in European history, the bubonic plague that killed up to half the population. Another one of those dramatic moments of vast, abrupt and shocking change, not unlike the one we're in. But Juliane of Norwich saw the natural world as the direct revelation of the most fundamental and fundamentally loving reality. Her word for it is God. She says, the first good thing is the goodness of nature. Mountains and rivers remain. God is the same thing as nature, she says. The goodness in nature is God. God feels great delight to be our Father. God feels great delight to be our Mother. And she goes on to say we experience a wondrous mix of well. What by well she means all things are well and shall be well. We can rely on all things as they are. That's at the heart of Juliane's depth of opening. She says we experience a wondrous mix of well and woe. And isn't that true of the time we're in? We have astonishing things happening, and at the same time we have such a strange sense of the beauties, the comforts, the small irritations of ordinary life continuing, well and woe. Juliane says we experience a wondrous mix of well and woe. The mingling of both well and distress in us is so astonishing that we can hardly tell which state we or our neighbours are in. That's how astonishing it is, she says. These are very interesting words to look into. The by now well-known encounter between Dumshan and a fellow monk and a moment down at the creek washing their bowls when a frog is torn apart in front of them. And the monk cries out, "Why does it come to this?" And Dumshan offers, addressing the wise part of that monk, says, "It is only for your benefit, Acharya." The whole of it, all of what is in that moment, as at the deepest level, only for your benefit. How do we realize this only for your benefit? Look at the monk's cry. Why does it come to this? And I'm sure all of us have been saying about the events around us, falling around our ears at the moment. Why does it come to this? How does it come to this extraordinary place? But in that cry of lament that just comes out of the throat of that monk, there's already the promise there of not knowing. He's not saying, it comes to this. He's saying, why? How? Is it so? There's an is it so inside that. Why does it come to this? There's wonder. There's openness. You could even say love or wellness, and I don't like the word wellness. I'm going to stick with Julian's well. There's well and woe there, vitally mixed. It's a vital mixture. We couldn't possibly be alive and responding beings without it. The strangeness of the moment of watching Donald Trump acting like a child in the White House and worse, under a kind of vast kind of imposture of imperial selfness, is very remarkable. It's a remarkable historical moment. And I was reminded of the fact that in Latin there are two words for authority of any kind. One is imperium, and that is Donald Trump. Imperium is power over, the assumption of power over, and it's utterly based in fear of the other. The alternative, the other way of regarding this matter of authority is the word auctoritas in Latin, and ultimately it's based in accord. It's based in an accord in which there is no other. Auctoritas is the authority offered from the heart of others to somebody who is, in a way, opening the way. And there's a kind of moment that I'd like to offer, an image that someone sent me of Joe Biden. I'm not making any great case for him to be a moment of salvation or a great saint. But it was a photo of him receiving the first two Navajo Indigenous women ever elected to Congress. And he was offering the very formal acknowledgement in Navajo terms. He was down on one knee, he had his head bowed, and he was offering his hand like this. And they were laughing in delight. And I would say that that's such a remarkably beautiful alternative, a turning around of the overweening kind of presence of this absurdity called Donald Trump. And all of its sort of 2-year-old omniscient assumption, that is so pathetic at heart and so fearful at heart. People talk about the 2-year-old moment in a human being as the one of omnipotence. Well, we've seen it writ large for the last 4 or 5 years on the world stage. So, mindful of the time, I'd like to end just by offering a wonderful meditation that I have been reminded of, just by the fact that, there's a play by Ionesco called The Rhinoceros, or just simply Rhinoceros. Some of you might know it. The premise of the play is that the main character discovers that everybody around him is turning into a rhinoceros. They were human some time ago, but he can't even remember what that was like now. And when he looks in a mirror now, he sees a human being, but it's almost monstrous because it's not a rhinoceros. And to not be a rhinoceros at such a moment is to be a kind of aberration. And so it's actually his play is a meditation on the kind of rampaging absurdity of this sense of well, it's many things. Many things are caught up in the play, but I want to take you to a meditation by Thomas Merton. Many of you will know it probably, Rain and the Rhinoceros. It was written around 60 years ago, but it seems entirely to the point right now. So what happened in this is that Thomas Merton being that Trappist monk, with a very, very strong interest in the contemplative life, obviously, but also in Zen. He was deeply drawn to Zen and to Buddhism in particular, but Zen in particular. It had obvious accord for him with the Desert Fathers, the solitary Christian meditative stream. So he retreated to a small hut with no electricity, just had a Coleman lamp for light. And this is in North Carolina, which has just been conceded to Donald Trump. And it started to rain heavily. The night became very dark. The rain surrounded the whole cabin with its enormous virginal myth, a whole world of meaning, of secrecy, of silence, of rumor. Think of it. All that speech pouring down, selling nothing, judging nobody, drenching the thick mulch of dead leaves, soaking the trees, filling the gullies and crannies of the wood with water, washing out the places where men have stripped the hillside. What a thing it is to sit absolutely alone in the forest at night, cherished by this wonderful, unintelligible, perfectly innocent speech, the most comforting speech in the world, the talk that rain makes by itself all over the ridges, and the talk of the watercourses everywhere in the hollows. Nobody started it. Nobody is going to stop it. It will talk as long as it wants, this rain. As long as it talks, I am going to listen. And he does, deeply, and it is worth listening to because it opens us, as you would know from your own meditation experience, when it starts to rain, how easily we start to open ourselves, more easily, at least, to no self, to not knowing. He goes on and says, there's no clock that can measure the speech of this rain that falls all night on the drowned and lonely forest. But then there's this, because he's living very close to Fort Knox, or this hut is close to Fort Knox, a large military base. He says, of course, at 3:30 a.m., the SAC plane goes over, red light winking low under the clouds, skimming the south side of the valley, loaded with strong medicine, very strong enough to burn up all these woods and stretch our hours of life into eternities. He's talking about nuclear weapons. He says the world, and then he starts to speak of this whole sense as the rhinoceros. This sense of the nearby military base as the rhinoceros, this stampede driven by fear and fortifying a sense of a self always in peril. And he references Ionesco's play, The Rhinoceros. And he also references the sense of how this is so dependent upon a vulnerable shell that we call the self. He says, now if we take our vulnerable shell to be our true identity, if we think that our mask is our true face, We will protect her with all the fabrications in the world, even at the cost of violating our own truth. He speaks of selves as selves that can stand back and see themselves having fun, an illusion which reassures them that they are real. You could say that Merton's whole meditation is attempting to embrace what is as the very foundation, the only foundation of whatever wisdom can emerge from the stilling of this sense of the hardened self. We experience a wondrous mix of well and woe. Remember those words. The mingling of both well and distress in us is so astonishing that we can hardly tell which state we or our neighbours are in. That's how astonishing it is. So there's no turning away from this mingling. And there's also no turning away from the way that the distress in us can be turned with openness. At the very end, he speaks of this. He says, the rain has stopped. The afternoon sun slants through the pine trees, and how those useless needles smell in the clear air. A dandelion, long out of season, has pushed itself into bloom between the smashed leaves of last summer's day lilies. The valley resounds with the totally uninformative talk of creeks and wild water. Then the quails begin their sweet whistling in the wet bushes. Their noise is absolutely useless, and so is the delight I take in it. There's nothing I would rather hear, not because it is a better noise than other noises, but because it is the voice of the present moment, the present festival. And then he adds, yet even here the earth shakes. Over at Fort Knox, the rhinoceros is having fun. His reference to the word fun is that the one cooking equipment and also light that he has is a little Coleman stove, which has written on it something like, this will greatly extend your hours of fun. So he's playing all the way through with the sense of the so-called fun with which so much of our world now is turned towards, as so much that is needing addressing is ignored. But this is the world that we must engage in waking up. So beyond doubt, what difficulty and anguish and whatever suffering comes our way to both discover and take the sounding of our true selves, it is only for your benefit. It, the whole of it, is only for our vast collective and seamless and borderless benefit. So this is what I would like us to take up in the last part of this morning together. There's a haiku of Basho's that I partly misremember, but this is how I remember it. A good world. The raindrops fall in twos and threes. Now you can take the twos and threes as just the perfect thusness of what happens. That is the good that is for all of us to utterly share. Now that's the fundamental ethos of our practice. As for the good, practice sharing it. There's also a challenge in that word good, a good world. It's the same challenge as Yunmen offers when he said, every day is a good day. There's no better or worse days in that word good. So good is a word that asks us to be completely present to what is, completely, to value all that is here, the whole of it, not good bits versus bad bits, to rely on the whole of it as the only place from which response can arise with coherence, congruent with what is happening. So let's, after the break, after our little break to make a cup of tea or whatever else needs doing, let's come back to this just very challenge in Basho's poem, A Good World. The raindrops fall in twos and threes. You can almost separate out twos and threes, but it's all rain, all rain. So let's come back and look at this question of responding in such a challenging time, coming right through that word good, as well as the good that we share, the beautiful, unplanned and blameless way the rain falls, and all that that offers. Mountains and rivers remain. Okay, so thank you for your trouble.